The narrative of America's formidable F6F Hellcat commenced not with victory, but rather with the limitations of its predecessor. During the initial phases of the Pacific War, U.S. Navy pilots operated the Grumman F4F Wildcat in engagements against Japan's Mitsubishi A6M0. The Wildcat was known for its durability, reliability, and ability to endure damage. However, it was also surpassed in terms of speed, climb rate, and agility. In confrontations with the nimble Zero, American aviators frequently found themselves at a disadvantage. Reports from the Solomon Islands and the Coral Sea consistently reflected this concern. If the U.S. Navy aspired to secure victory in the Pacific, it required a new fighter that could either match or surpass the Zero in aerial combat. Grumman, already recognized for its production of robust naval aircraft, became the focal point of this necessity. The engineers at the company comprehended the pilot's requirements. Ensuring survivability was crucial, as naval fighters operated from aircraft carriers where even slight damage could determine whether a pilot could land safely or had to ditch into the ocean. Nevertheless, enhancements in speed, firepower, and maneuverability were imperative. The solution materialized in a design study referred to as the G50, which would eventually develop into the F6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was larger than the Wildcat, featuring a wider wing and a more robust frame. It was conceived from the beginning to utilize the powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP radial engine, which produced over 2,000 horsepower. This power enabled the fighter to achieve speeds approaching 380 km/h, with a climbing capability that could finally rival the Zero. For defense, Grumman incorporated armor for the cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks, features that were often absent in Japanese fighters. The design philosophy was unmistakable: create an aircraft that could absorb damage, deliver substantial firepower, and provide American pilots with a genuine opportunity in aerial engagements. Firepower emerged as a hallmark feature. The Hellcat was equipped with 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, capable of unleashing a barrage of bullets against enemy aircraft. This armament proved to be not only lethal against the lightly constructed Japanese fighters, but also devastating when used against bombers. The ammunition capacity was ample, allowing pilots to engage multiple times during a single sortie. In contrast to the Zero, which depended on lightness and agility, the Hellcat represented the American approach of overwhelming strength. Its development timeline was indicative of the urgency of wartime needs. The first prototype took to the skies in June 1942, just months following the shocking attack on Pearl Harbor. By the time the aircraft commenced full production in 1943, American carriers were already advancing deeper into the Pacific, necessitating a fighter capable of dominance. The Hellcat arrived precisely when it was needed to fulfill that role. For Japanese commanders, intelligence reports regarding the new fighter began to emerge. Pilots and engineers examined captured American aircraft and were initially dismissive, convinced that the Zeros still held superiority. However, those early assessments would soon prove to be catastrophic. The Hellcat was not merely an enhancement. It represented a revolutionary advancement that integrated durability, firepower, and performance in a manner that the Japanese could not replicate. Within the hangars of American carriers, the Hellcat began to swiftly replace the older Wildcats. Its wide stance facilitated easier landings on carrier decks, and its robust engine enabled it to take off with substantial loads of fuel and ammunition. Maintenance crews lauded its reliability, a vital aspect in the harsh conditions of the Pacific War. By mid-1943, the Hellcat had evolved beyond being just another fighter. It had become the spearhead of a new era in naval aviation. The Japanese had yet to comprehend it, but the skies over the Pacific had irrevocably changed. The Zero, once feared as an unparalleled predator, was about to confront an adversary specifically engineered to hunt it down. The emergence of the Hellcat signified the onset of an unyielding campaign of aerial supremacy, one that would torment Japanese pilots for the remainder of the war. By the summer of 1943, the Hellcat had transitioned from a mere promising prototype to a formidable frontline fighter. The U.S. Navy carriers, which had suffered significant losses during the initial years of the Pacific Campaign, now had an aircraft that could alter the balance of power. These large, flat-topped ships, akin to floating steel cities, served as the launchpad for the Hellcat's emergence. On their decks, numerous broad-winged fighters were armed and fueled, poised to ascend into the skies above island chains and expansive oceanic areas. Deployment commenced earnestly with the Essex-class carriers, which were introduced into service concurrently with the Hellcat. This combination of new carriers and fighters forged a partnership that endowed the U.S. Navy with unparalleled striking capabilities. Hellcats could launch in waves, provide bomber escorts, patrol the seas, or intercept enemy formations before they could reach the fleet. For both sailors and airmen, there was a tangible feeling that they now had the means to take the offensive. However, the Japanese began to observe disconcerting developments. For almost 2 years, their Mitsubishi Zero had dominated the skies. Japanese pilots had become accustomed to controlling the terms of engagement, relying on the Zero's tight turns and rapid climbs. Yet once Hellcats entered combat zones, such as the Central Pacific and the Solomon Islands, Japanese reports began to reflect a different narrative. Patrols that once returned with confidence now came back unsettled, or did not return at all. The Americans had introduced a fighter capable of enduring damage, diving swiftly, and delivering firepower that the Zero could not withstand. Aboard carriers like the USS Essex, Yorktown, and Bunker Hill, Hellcat squadrons started to craft a new chapter in naval warfare. Pilots trained rigorously in deck takeoffs and landings, mastering the peculiarities of the aircraft. In comparison to the Wildcat, the Hellcat was more manageable, its robust landing gear accommodating the harsh impacts of carrier operations. Naval aviators quickly developed a strong trust in it, commending its visibility, the reliable precision of its gunfire, and its capacity to absorb enemy fire while still returning home. Carrier commanders observed that maintenance requirements were less demanding than anticipated, allowing Hellcats to conduct mission after mission without significant delays. The deployment strategy was straightforward: saturate the skies with Hellcats. Each carrier managed multiple squadrons, often comprising dozens of aircraft, which ensured that American forces retained both numerical and qualitative superiority. This situation was unsettling for the Japanese. The overwhelming presence of Hellcats on the horizon during major operations created the illusion of an inexhaustible supply of American fighters. What troubled them the most was the realization that every pilot confronting a Hellcat faced a diminished chance of survival compared to before. Tales began circulating among Japanese pilots, recounting instances of entire Zero squadrons being annihilated in mere minutes. Accounts emerged of Hellcats absorbing hits that would have destroyed a Zero, and of American pilots who no longer feared engaging in close combat. The perception of invincibility surrounding the Zero began to fracture, leading to a decline in the morale of many airmen. Although the Zero retained its agility, that agility alone no longer assured victory. For the Americans, this transformation was liberating. Carrier task forces could now advance into Japanese-controlled waters with increased confidence. Rather than dreading air raids, they actively sought them, knowing that Hellcats served as their protective shield. As the carriers progressed across the Pacific, the dark blue silhouette of the Hellcat became a recognizable and fearsome sight for Japanese forces. Each deployment reinforced a new reality. The U.S. Navy had established dominance over the skies, and the Japanese would find it challenging to reclaim that control. When the Hellcat first engaged the Mitsubishi Zero in open combat, the encounter represented more than just a battle between machines. It was a clash of two philosophies of aerial warfare. The Japanese designed the Zero to be lightweight, agile, and fast in tight maneuvers. It was a predator intended to strike first, overwhelm its adversary with swift turns, and rely on the pilot's skill to evade damage. The Americans, however, had designed the Hellcat as a bastion of steel and firepower, exhibiting a slower roll but remarkable resilience. The battlefield would ultimately determine which strategy would dominate the skies of the Pacific. The initial dogfights took place in late 1943 during raids over the Gilbert Islands. Pilots who had previously struggled in Wildcats suddenly found themselves capable of controlling the engagement. The Hellcat's speed during a dive provided American aviators with the opportunity to disengage when needed, or to chase down retreating Zeros with overwhelming force. Where a Wildcat pilot had been compelled to adopt defensive tactics, a Hellcat pilot could confront the Zero directly. In one encounter over Tarawa, a squadron of Hellcats engaged a Japanese patrol, successfully downing multiple Zeros without losing a single aircraft. For the first time, U.S. Navy pilots expressed confidence in having the advantage. What astonished Japanese aviators the most was the Hellcat's resilience. Zeros were equipped with only light 7.7mm machine guns and a pair of 20mm cannons. Against fragile aircraft like the Wildcat, these armaments had proven deadly. However, when shells impacted a Hellcat, the armored cockpit and self-sealing fuel tanks frequently allowed it to remain operational. Pilots returned to their carriers with wings torn, oil leaking, and holes throughout the fuselage, yet still alive. Japanese after-action reports began to characterize the new American fighter as impervious and relentless. One officer cautioned that the Hellcat could withstand more fire than any aircraft they had encountered. The kill ratios illustrated the situation even more clearly. In its initial months of combat, the Hellcat claimed numerous enemy aircraft while sustaining minimal losses. This trend only intensified as more squadrons transitioned to the new fighter. Pilots such as David McCampbell, who would later become America's top Navy ace, began to establish their legacies in the cockpit of the Hellcat. He and others proved that in skilled hands, the F6F was nearly invulnerable. The Japanese attempted to adapt. Some sought to take advantage of the Hellcat's heavier structure by forcing engagements into tight turning battles. Yet the Americans had instead. They employed energy tactics, utilizing climbing and diving maneuvers, capitalizing on the Hellcat's horsepower. This approach effectively countered the Zero's agility, compelling it into scenarios where its thin armor and limited firepower resulted in inevitable defeat. The previous supremacy of Japanese pilots faded, as they recognized they were now contending with an adversary capable of dictating the terms of engagement. For the individuals within those cockpits, the psychological impact was profound. Japanese aviators, once esteemed as elite warriors, now confronted a machine that transformed every encounter into a gamble heavily weighted against them. In contrast, American pilots operated with increasing assurance. They relied on their aircraft for protection, trusted their firepower to accomplish the mission, and depended on their numerical advantage to overwhelm the opposition. By early 1944, the Hellcat had firmly established itself as the dominant force in the Pacific skies. The Zero had ceased to be a representation of Japanese invincibility, becoming instead a remnant of an earlier phase of the conflict. Each subsequent confrontation further widened the divide between the two factions, and every Hellcat triumph contributed to the legend that would instill fear in Japanese pilots henceforth. The true extent of the Hellcat's supremacy was revealed during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, an engagement that Japanese survivors would recall with trepidation. This confrontation, later referred to by American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, not only highlighted the Hellcat's superiority, but also the deteriorating condition of Japanese naval aviation. As U.S. forces progressed to capture the Marana Islands, Japan launched its carriers in a desperate bid to halt the offensive. Hundreds of aircraft, including fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes, took to the skies to confront the Americans. Awaiting them above the expansive Pacific in organized formations were squadrons of F6F Hellcats. When radar screens aboard American carriers illuminated with the sight of approaching Japanese waves, Hellcats ascended into the sky. Unlike the earlier years of the conflict, when Japanese surprise assaults frequently overwhelmed defenses, the Americans were now ready. Advanced radar, coordinated fighter direction, and disciplined tactics ensured that Hellcats intercepted enemy planes far from the fleet. As the first Japanese formations approached, the sky erupted into chaos. For the Japanese, the sight was terrifying. Instead of encountering a few defending fighters, they faced swarms of Hellcats that appeared endless. Each one unleashed devastating fire from 6 heavy machine guns, resulting in catastrophic outcomes. Zeros, designed for agility, crumpled under the relentless barrage. Dive bombers and torpedo planes, slow and vulnerable, were engulfed in flames before they could even reach their targets. The Americans cut through the attacking waves with mechanical efficiency, their blue-painted Hellcats streaking across the sky like predators. The losses were staggering. In a single day, over 300 Japanese aircraft were destroyed, while American losses were limited to the dozens. Hellcat pilots recorded kill after kill, often returning to carriers with their ammunition depleted, and victory tallies etched into their memories. For many aviators, it felt less like combat and more like slaughter, hence the grim nickname, Turkey Shoot. The imbalance revealed just how far the Japanese air arm had declined, and how completely the Hellcat had taken control of the skies. Japanese accounts described the experience as nightmarish. Survivors reported feeling hunted, unable to outmaneuver or outfight the new American fighter. One pilot later recalled that engaging a Hellcat was akin to facing death itself. Even skilled veterans found their tactics rendered obsolete. Younger, inexperienced aviators, rushing into combat due to shortages, stood little chance at all. The terror of the Hellcat became a whisper among squadrons, a realization that no amount of bravery could counterbalance the overwhelming odds. The battle also marked a pivotal moment in naval warfare. With so many aircraft lost, Japan's carriers were reduced to near irrelevance. The once proud striking arm of the Imperial Navy had been decimated in a single engagement, never to recover. In the meantime, the Hellcats maintained their dominance, with their squadrons becoming increasingly formidable with each sortie. The U.S. Navy not only achieved victory in the skies over the Marianas, but also shattered the foundation of Japanese naval aviation. For American pilots, this triumph was accompanied by a blend of exhilaration and apprehension. They recognized their involvement in a significant historical moment, a battle that ensured air superiority in the Pacific. However, they were also acutely aware of the psychological burden of their actions. In mere hours, thousands of enemy aviators had been eliminated from the conflict, leaving Japan's air defenses severely weakened. The Hellcat, once seen merely as a tool, evolved into a representation of relentless American might, a machine that instilled fear even before it graced the skies. Following the devastation in the Philippine Sea, the Hellcat emerged as the unmistakable emblem of U.S. naval supremacy. Wherever American carrier task forces ventured, they carried with them the assurance of aerial destruction. By late 1944, Japan's naval aviation had been severely diminished. Nevertheless, the war continued, and the Hellcat remained pivotal in nearly every operation. For the Japanese garrisons dispersed throughout the Pacific, the presence of American carriers signified one inevitable outcome. Sooner or later, the blue-winged Hellcats would descend upon them unyielding and overpowering. As the U.S. progressed through the Central Pacific towards the Philippines, carrier groups unleashed Hellcats in large-scale strikes. Their missions transcended air-to-air combat. They soared over enemy islands, strafing airfields, obliterating aircraft on the ground, and denying Japanese pilots any chance to contest the skies. From Guam to Plo to Leh, Hellcats not only protected bombers and torpedo planes, but also facilitated amphibious invasions. Each wave of aircraft darkened the sky with noise and firepower, creating a relentless storm that Japan could neither evade nor withstand. What rendered the Hellcat's role particularly daunting for Japanese defenders was its omnipresence. Before Japanese pilots could sometimes anticipate American maneuvers, they relied on reconnaissance. However, with carriers moving freely across the Pacific, the Hellcats could emerge at any location at any moment. The mobility of the carrier fleets rendered every island, harbor, and supply line vulnerable. Reports from isolated Japanese units convey a growing sense of despair. Even in areas that were thought to be secure, the sudden roar of radial engines overhead heralded impending doom. The Japanese Navy and Army endeavored to counter this threat by dispersing their aircraft, constructing concealed airstrips, and rapidly training replacement pilots. Nevertheless, none of these strategies could turn the tide. Hellcats appeared to proliferate in the sky, and with each engagement, their kill counts escalated. American industry manufactured thousands of these fighters, ensuring that losses were swiftly compensated and squadrons remained adequately staffed. This unyielding replenishment fostered the perception of an inexhaustible machine relentlessly eroding Japanese resistance. On the ground, Japanese soldiers began to fear the strafing runs of Hellcats as much as they did aerial confrontations with 6 heavy machine guns. Each passed devastated trucks, artillery, and supply depots. Even bunkers were not spared. Repeated assaults could dismantle defenses and leave survivors in a state of shock. For many who battled in jungles and on beaches, the Hellcat was as much a weapon of terror as it was a means of achieving air superiority. It symbolized an unseen force of destruction, perpetually circling and waiting. Naval commanders swiftly acknowledged that with Hellcats as protectors, carrier task forces could operate without restraint. Entire fleets advanced into contested waters without the fear of significant air assaults. Japanese attempts at counterstrikes faltered long before they reached their objectives, intercepted and obliterated by squadrons of Hellcats conducting combat air patrols. The carriers themselves, once vulnerable giants, became untouchable behind the protective wall of fighters. This enabled the U.S. Navy to advance with assurance, extending their reach ever closer to Japan itself. For Japanese aviators who continued to take to the skies, the psychological burden intensified. Few were expected to survive encounters with Hellcats. Tales circulated of squadrons being annihilated in mere minutes, with Hellcats emerging from the sun in a relentless fury. Veterans who had once fought valiantly with Zeros now faced missions that appeared to be little more than acts of suicide. The fear was not solely of death, but also of futility, as they understood their efforts could not alter the war's outcome. By the end of 1944, the Pacific had effectively become an American-controlled theater. The Hellcat had evolved into more than just an aircraft. It was a shadow looming over every Japanese stronghold, a constant reminder that the skies of the empire no longer belonged to them. As the war approached its conclusion, the psychological impact of the Hellcat was as deadly as its firepower. Among Japanese aviators, the fear of the blue-painted American fighter transformed into a quiet obsession. Veteran pilots who had once spoken with pride about their Zero squadrons now referred to the Hellcat as an unstoppable beast, one that devoured entire formations with ruthless efficiency. For the younger, hastily trained replacements, the mere whisper of facing Hellcats was sufficient to instill dread before they even left the ground. The Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Service had been decimated by attrition. Training programs, once thorough, had been condensed to mere weeks to compensate for staggering losses. Inexperienced pilots, some barely acquainted with their instruments, were hurried into cockpits and instructed to hold back the advancing wave of American aircraft. However, when these novices encountered Hellcats in the skies, their lack of experience was brutally exposed. American pilots, now seasoned by hundreds of sorties, exploited every error. The outcome was a massacre that further intensified the sense of inevitability surrounding the Hellcat. Eyewitness accounts from Japanese aviators reflect the despair. Some recounted feelings of being hunted, unable to devise a successful tactic. The Hellcat's robust armor ensured that even when bullets struck, the enemy aircraft often remained in the fight. Reports emerged of Hellcats returning to their carriers pockmarked with bullet holes yet still airborne. Others described how American formations appeared limitless, with wave after wave of fighters surfacing regardless of how many were downed. Engaging them felt akin to battling the ocean itself. One Japanese pilot later reflected, "Endless and unstoppable." American intelligence officers observed a shift in tone during the interrogation of captured pilots. In the early stages of the war, Japanese aviators spoke with confidence about their Zero and their training. However, by 1944 and 1945, their statements conveyed a sense of resignation. Many confessed they no longer believed they could achieve victory in the skies. Some even admitted they regarded their missions not as combat, but as mere delays, buying a few hours or days for Japanese ground defenses, fully aware they would not return. Hellcat pilots also perceived this change. In after-action reports, American aviators noted that enemies disengaged from battles sooner than before, or launched attacks with less conviction. The once sharp and aggressive tactics that had made the Zero a formidable adversary were diminishing. Instead, Japanese fighters frequently dispersed under pressure, rendering them easier targets. Pilots like Commander David McCampbell, who set records for achieving ace status in a single day in his Hellcat, epitomized the growing divide between the two forces. His accomplishments, widely reported, reinforced the belief that American fighters were invulnerable, while their Japanese counterparts faced inevitable defeat. The fear extended beyond the aerial domain. Japanese ground troops began to associate the deep rumble of the Hellcat's radial engine with impending destruction. Infantrymen, upon hearing the approach of aircraft, no longer anticipated assistance from their own air force. Instead, they prepared for strafing runs and bombing raids. The silhouette of the Hellcat became a symbol of supremacy, feared by soldiers on the ground as much as by pilots in the air. For Japanese commanders, the psychological disintegration of their air force represented a strategic catastrophe. Regardless of how valiantly their pilots fought, morale continued to decline. Despair eroded discipline, while fear spread more rapidly than reinforcements could arrive. Each Hellcat sortie reinforced this message. The skies were dominated by America, and nothing Japan could construct or train would alter that fact. As the war approached its final year, the Hellcat evolved into more than just a machine. It became a legend, an aerial specter that haunted the minds of Japanese aviators, persuading them that the battle was already lost before it even commenced. By late 1944 and into 1945, the Hellcat confronted a new and desperate adversary, the kamikaze. Japan, staggering from devastating losses and unable to replenish its experienced pilots, resorted to the grim tactic of intentional suicide attacks. Pilots, often with minimal training, were commanded to crash their planes directly into American vessels in a final effort to cause significant damage. For the U.S. Navy, this strategy marked a frightening evolution in the air war. The Hellcat served as the primary defense against this desperate assault. Carrier groups advancing towards the Philippines and later Okinawa were acutely aware of the threat. Radar screens frequently illuminated with incoming signals, not from squadrons maneuvering for combat, but from scattered groups of kamikazes hurtling towards the fleet. The Hellcats were scrambled with urgency, their pilots cognizant that every enemy they failed to intercept could claim hundreds of American lives aboard a carrier, cruiser, or destroyer. Unlike previous battles, where victory was defined by downing fighters and bombers in conventional combat, these new missions became a race against time. The confrontations were grim. Kamikazes did not evade. They dove directly for the ships. Hellcat pilots had to shoot them down before they could reach the fleet, and even then, debris sometimes crashed onto the decks. Pilots recounted witnessing burning aircraft continuing their suicidal dive, despite being perforated with bullets. For the Americans, the Hellcat's speed and firepower provided the best opportunity for interception. However, the pressure was immense, every missed target. Despite the terror, the Hellcat demonstrated an impressive level of effectiveness. Throughout the Battle of Leyte Gulf and the extended campaign for Okinawa, Hellcat squadrons successfully intercepted hundreds of kamikaze attacks. The kill ratios remained astonishing, with numerous Japanese aircraft being destroyed for each Hellcat lost. The immense firepower of the 650 caliber guns frequently obliterated incoming attackers within seconds. Many naval officers attributed the preservation of entire task forces from annihilation to the Hellcat, which served as the final line of defense between kamikaze pilots and their intended targets. For Japanese pilots, the dread of encountering Hellcats lingered even during suicide missions. Some never even reached the fleet, being shot down miles away by vigilant American fighters. Survivors from training units recounted how numerous kamikaze missions culminated in fiery deaths far from their designated objectives, all due to the unyielding Hellcat patrols. The tactic intended to instill fear in American sailors often backfired, instead fostering a sense among Japanese aviators that their sacrifices were futile against an adversary that consistently intercepted them. The effect on morale was catastrophic. Young kamikazes preparing for their final flights frequently heard tales of Hellcats lurking like vultures above the ocean. Letters and diaries disclosed the anxiety many experienced, not of death itself, which they had been conditioned to accept, but of being shot down in vain before reaching their targets. The Hellcat deprived them of even the grim purpose they had been assigned. On the American front, the psychological toll was significant as well. Hellcat pilots often felt powerless as some kamikazes managed to penetrate their defenses, striking ships with devastating consequences. Nevertheless, they were acutely aware that their aircraft represented the only genuine defense. Each successful interception reinforced the Hellcat's position as the protector of the fleet. Its reputation, already formidable, continued to expand, not merely as the destroyer of Japan's elite air force, but as the slayer of kamikazes, the shield against Japan's final wave of desperation. By the spring of 1945, the role of the Hellcat had transitioned from a symbol of dominance to one of protection. It represented both the offensive power and defensive strength of the U.S. Navy, ensuring that Japan's final attempt in the skies would conclude in the same despair that had plagued its pilots since the Hellcat's initial emergence. By the time Japan was on the verge of collapse in mid-1945, the Hellcat's reputation had already been etched into history. It was not merely another aircraft. It was the terror of the Pacific skies, the machine that Japanese pilots dreaded and American pilots relied on immensely. Its legacy was documented in figures as remarkable as its presence in combat. Over 75% of all aerial victories claimed by the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps during the Pacific War were attributed to Hellcat squadrons. The aircraft achieved an unparalleled kill ratio of nearly 19-to-1. Against the renowned Mitsubishi Zero, the aircraft that had once dominated the Pacific, the Hellcat proved to be a merciless executioner. This extraordinary achievement was not solely due to engineering, although the design of the Hellcat played a crucial role. It represented the collaboration of American industry, strategy, and training. Factories back home produced over 12,000 Hellcats in just 2 years, ensuring that the Navy was never short of aircraft. Carriers, replenished with continuous waves of planes, extended their reach deep into enemy territory. Pilots underwent training in structured, systematic programs that emphasized tactics to leverage the Hellcat's strengths, avoiding the mistakes that had cost lives in the war's early days. Collectively, this formed a war machine that overwhelmed Japan's diminishing resources. For Japanese aviators, the Hellcat became a symbol of futility. Veterans recounted the despair of confronting a fighter they could neither outgun nor outlast. Younger pilots, thrust into cockpits with minimal training, described the Hellcat as a shadow that extinguished their lives before they had even begun to truly engage in combat. Ground soldiers who observed dogfights above their positions were acutely aware of the Hellcat's dominance, the blue silhouettes perpetually returning in triumph. By the concluding year of the conflict, the mere sound of a radial engine overhead instilled terror within Japanese ranks. However, the legacy of the Hellcat transcended mere fear. For American sailors and aviators, it represented survival. Pilots who could have met their demise in less resilient aircraft were able to fly once more. Carrier groups that could have been severely damaged by enemy assaults instead advanced across the Pacific, island by island, until Japan itself was within reach. For the personnel aboard carriers, the Hellcat served as both sword and shield, a testament to the Navy's ability to harness the full power of technology and industry in pursuit of victory. When the war concluded, the Hellcat was recognized as one of the most effective fighter aircraft ever constructed. It had decimated Japan's air force, shattered the myth of the Zero, and instilled in America the confidence to take the initiative across an ocean. For the Japanese, it left enduring scars that persisted long after the final battle. Pilots recalled the helplessness of confronting swarms of Hellcats, the futility of engaging in dogfights against them, and the despair of knowing the outcome before the battle even commenced. Even decades later, the name Hellcat conjured both pride and fear. Pride for those who piloted it under the stars and stripes, and fear for those who encountered it in the rising sun. More than merely a fighter, it evolved into a symbol of America's naval air dominance, the machine that carried the war across the Pacific and secured ultimate victory. For Japan's pilots, it was a nightmare with wings. For history, it served as undeniable evidence that the balance of power in the air had irrevocably shifted.